The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Jefferson County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Dr. Sarah Bennett hurried through the security checkpoint, clutching her worn leather bag close to her chest. She hadn't planned on being in court today. Her field research had been interrupted by this unexpected traffic citation. At 42, Dr. Bennett was used to people underestimating her. Her casual attire, faded jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and comfortable walking shoes reflected her hands-on approach to anthropological research. Today, she had been documenting life in rural communities when a police officer pulled her over for a minor traffic violation. The courthouse buzzed with activity. People in suits rushed past, their footsteps echoing off the marble walls. Security guards nodded at lawyers they recognized, while nervous defendants whispered to their attorneys. Sarah checked the digital display board. Courtroom 3B, Judge William Harrison presiding. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 3B, the familiar smell of old books and furniture polish filled her nostrils. The room was already half full, with about 20 people seated on the wooden benches. A court clerk sat at his desk, organizing papers with mechanical efficiency. Judge William Harrison sat behind his elevated bench, his silver hair and black robe giving him an air of authority that commanded respect. At 60, he had served on this bench for over 15 years, developing a reputation for being strict but fair. However, today, something about his demeanor seemed different. Sarah found a seat in the third row, taking out her citation paperwork. She watched as Judge Harrison handled several cases before hers. His interactions were brief, but respectful with the well-dressed defendants, mostly white professionals who lived in the better parts of town. "Sarah Bennett," the clerk called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Sarah stood up, smoothing her shirt as she walked to the podium. She could feel Judge Harrison's eyes on her, taking in her casual appearance and field-worn backpack. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening of the lips. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison began, emphasizing the Ms. with a tone that made it clear he had already formed an opinion. "You're here for running a stop sign in the Millbrook area?" He barely glanced at the papers before him. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly, her voice carrying the educated tone of someone who had spent years in academia. "But I would like to explain the circumstances." "The circumstances," Judge Harrison interrupted, "are quite clear from the officer's report. You failed to come to a complete stop at a clearly marked intersection." His tone was dismissive, different from how he had addressed the previous defendants. Sarah noticed several heads in the courtroom turn toward them, picking up on the judge's changed demeanor. A young law clerk at the side of the room looked uncomfortable, shifting papers unnecessarily. "Your Honor," Sarah began again, maintaining her composure, "I was conducting field research in the area for the university's anthropology department when—" "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison cut in again, "your occupation is irrelevant to the fact that you violated a basic traffic law." He shuffled some papers on his desk, clearly preparing to move on to his judgment. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker. A few spectators exchanged glances, recognizing the unfair treatment unfolding before them. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, capturing every word of the increasingly tense exchange. Sarah stood straight, her years of studying human behavior allowing her to read the situation clearly. She saw the assumptions in Judge Harrison's eyes, the quick conclusions he had drawn based on her appearance and race. As an anthropologist, she'd had documented similar interactions countless times, but now she was experiencing it firsthand in a place where justice was supposed to be blind. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. The American flag behind the judge's bench hung still, its colors vivid against the dark wood paneling. In this moment, frozen between accusation and defense, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Little did Judge Harrison know that the woman standing before him had published numerous papers on institutional bias, had lectured at prestigious universities worldwide, and had recently been featured in the very academic journal that sat on his home office desk. The next few moments would shatter his preconceptions and force him to confront his own deeply held biases in front of a full courtroom. Judge Harrison peered down at Sarah over his reading glasses, his expression stern and unyielding. The citation paper in his hands trembled slightly as he held it up, making a show of reviewing it once again. The morning light caught his gold wedding ring as he gestured dismissively. According to the officer's report, he announced, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, you not only ran the stop sign but argued with the officer about the violation. He paused for effect, looking around the courtroom as if seeking agreement from the spectators. Sarah remained calm, though her heart beat faster. She noticed how different his tone was from just minutes ago when he had handled a similar traffic violation from a well-dressed white businessman. That case had been dismissed with a warning and a friendly smile. Your Honor, if I may explain, Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison interrupted, emphasizing Ms. again with barely concealed condescension. I don't need to hear excuses. The law is the law, and it applies equally to everyone. The irony of his statement hung heavy in the air, lost only on him. The young law clerk at the side of the room shifted uncomfortably again, now openly watching the exchange with concern. Several people in the gallery whispered among themselves, recognizing the obvious disparity in treatment. The fine will be $300, Judge Harrison declared, the amount significantly higher than what he had imposed on similar violations earlier that morning. And I'm adding court costs of $150. He scribbled on the paper with unnecessary force. Sarah took a deep breath, her anthropologist's mind already analyzing every aspect of this interaction. She had spent years studying power dynamics and institutional bias, but experiencing it so blatantly in a court of law was different from documenting it in her research. Your Honor, she spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of her expertise. I am Dr. Sarah Bennett, and I was conducting authorized research for. Dr. Bennett? Judge Harrison's pen stopped mid-signature. Something in his tone changed slightly, a barely perceptible shift. You're a medical doctor. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied, standing straighter. I hold a PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. I'm currently leading a research project on rural community dynamics funded by the National Science Foundation. The day of the citation, I was collecting data in Millbrook for this study. The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Harrison's expression flickered between disbelief and confusion. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her machine, waiting for what would come next. A woman in the gallery, who had been watching intently, suddenly gasped in recognition. Oh my God, she whispered to her companion, loud enough for others to hear. She's that professor from the university. I just read about her work in the Sunday paper. Judge Harrison's face began to redden. He shuffled through some papers on his desk, perhaps searching for something to say. The power dynamic in the room had shifted palpably, and everyone felt it. I have the research permit and university documentation with me, Sarah continued calmly, reaching into her worn leather bag, as well as letters from the county commissioner's office authorizing our study in various neighborhoods, including Millbrook. The judge's hands, now slightly unsteady, reached for the glass of water beside him. He took a long sip, buying time as he processed this new information. The same academic he had just treated with such disdain was likely the author of several papers he had recently read and admired. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should review the full circumstances of this incident. His tone had completely changed, now carrying a hint of uncertainty and embarrassment. The spectators in the courtroom watched this transformation with interest. Some smiled knowingly, while others shook their heads at the obvious display of prejudice they had just witnessed. Sarah stood patiently at the podium, her years of field experience helping her maintain her professional composure. She had documented countless instances of bias in her research, but now she was more than an observer. She was an active participant in a moment that would likely become a powerful example in her next paper. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but now it seemed to illuminate more than just the courtroom. It was shining a light on the hidden biases that could lurk even in the halls of justice. Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses slowly, wiping them with a white handkerchief he pulled from his robe pocket. His hands trembled slightly as his mind raced back to the academic journal he had been reading just last weekend, the one with the groundbreaking article about systemic bias in rural communities. Dr. Bennett, he said, his voice now carrying a different kind of uncertainty, would you happen to be the same Dr. Bennett who published the recent paper on institutional patterns in small-town America? Sarah nodded calmly. Yes, Your Honor. That paper was published in the Journal of Contemporary Anthropology last month. She paused, noticing how the judge's face had turned an even deeper shade of red. It's part of my ongoing research about how social structures and prejudices affect daily interactions in our justice system. The courtroom had become so quiet that you could hear the old ceiling fan creaking above. The court clerk had stopped shuffling papers, and even the usually restless spectators sat perfectly still, absorbed in the unfolding drama. I found your paper quite enlightening," Judge Harrison admitted. His earlier arrogance completely disappeared. "Particularly your observations about unconscious bias in authority figures." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Sarah pulled out a folder from her worn leather bag. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to explain why I was in Millbrook that day. Our research team was documenting community responses to traffic laws in different neighborhoods." She smiled slightly. "The stop sign in question is actually part of our study area." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, acutely aware that he had just provided a perfect example for Dr. Bennett's research. "The officer who issued the citation," Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, "wasn't aware of our research permit. I tried to explain, but he seemed unwilling to listen." She placed several official-looking documents on the podium. "I have all the necessary permissions here." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his demeanor now completely transformed. The same woman he had been ready to fine heavily minutes ago was suddenly revealed as a respected scholar whose work he had admired. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face. "Dr. Bennett, I must admit I'm embarrassed," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "I fear I may have just demonstrated exactly the kind of behavioral patterns your research discusses." Several heads nodded in the gallery. A young law student in the back row was furiously taking notes, clearly recognizing the significance of this moment. "Your Honor," Sarah responded, her anthropologist's training helping her handle this delicate situation. "These moments of recognition are valuable learning opportunities. In fact, this entire interaction will provide interesting data for our study on how authority figures process and respond to their own biases when they're made aware of them." The judge's eyes widened slightly as he realized that his own behavior would likely appear in a future academic paper. He straightened in his chair, trying to regain his composure. "The court clerk will provide me with those research permits," he said, gesturing to the young man who quickly approached the podium. "And Dr. Bennett, I believe the university's sociology department is hosting a symposium next week on community relations. Will you be presenting?" "Actually, I'm the keynote speaker," Sarah replied, watching as this information further impacted the judge's demeanor. "My presentation will focus on how institutional awareness can lead to positive systemic change." The transformation in the courtroom was complete. The same judge who had been ready to impose an excessive fine now looked at Dr. Bennett with respect and curiosity. The spectators watched as power dynamics shifted before their eyes, witnessing a real-time lesson in prejudice and recognition. A young black girl sitting with her mother in the gallery stared at Dr. Bennett with wide-eyed admiration. Her mother whispered something in her ear, and the girl smiled broadly, seeing possibility and power in this unexpected courtroom scene. The morning had turned into an impromptu lesson about assumptions, authority, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse window seemed brighter somehow, illuminating not just the room but the minds within it. Judge Harrison sat back in his leather chair, studying the research permits and university documents spread before him. Each paper he read further confirmed not only Dr. Bennett's credentials but also the uncomfortable reality of his own biased behavior. The courtroom remained silent, watching this powerful moment of self-realization unfold. "Dr. Bennett," he began, his voice noticeably softer than before, "I owe you more than just an apology. I believe we're witnessing exactly the kind of institutional bias your research addresses." He removed his reading glasses again, this time placing them carefully on his desk. "Would you be willing to share some of your findings with the court?" Sarah nodded, her anthropologist's mind already processing this remarkable shift in dynamics. Just 15 minutes ago, this same judge had barely allowed her to speak. Now, he was inviting her to lecture. "Your Honor," she began, turning slightly to include the entire courtroom in her explanation, Our research shows that authority figures often make split-second judgments based on appearance and perceived social status. She gestured to her casual field clothes. For instance, my choice of work attire today, combined with my race, led to immediate assumptions about my education and status. Several people in the gallery nodded, including a well-dressed black woman who had been watching the proceedings intently. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word of this unprecedented exchange. We've documented hundreds of similar interactions, Sarah continued, her voice clear and confident. When professionals of color dress casually, they're often treated with less respect than their white counterparts in similar attire. This bias becomes even more pronounced in formal settings like courtrooms. Judge Harrison's face flushed deeper. "And I just provided you with a perfect case study, didn't I?" he asked, attempting a small smile despite his evident embarrassment. "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah replied kindly, "your willingness to acknowledge and discuss these biases openly is rather unusual. Most authority figures become defensive when confronted with evidence of their prejudice." The young law clerk nodded vigorously, probably remembering similar scenes from other cases. A few attorneys present exchanged knowing looks, having witnessed countless examples of what Dr. Bennett described. "Tell me, Dr. Bennett." Judge Harrison leaned forward, genuinely interested now. "In your research, what percentage of authority figures recognize their bias when it's pointed out to them?" Sarah opened her field notebook, filled with careful observations and statistics. "Less than 20%, Your Honor. Most either deny the bias exists or attempt to justify their behavior. Your response today puts you in a rather select group." A murmur of interest rippled through the courtroom. The same young girl who had been watching with admiration now pulled out her own notebook, mimicking Dr. Bennett's professional demeanor. "The traffic citation," Judge Harrison said, picking up the paper that had started this whole interaction, "was issued in an area where we've had numerous complaints about biased enforcement. Your research team selected that location deliberately, didn't you?" Sarah smiled. "Yes, Your Honor. We've been documenting traffic stops in different neighborhoods, analyzing how enforcement patterns vary based on the demographic makeup of each area." The judge looked thoughtful, tapping his fingers on his desk. The morning sunlight caught his wedding ring again, but this time it seemed to highlight a moment of genuine change rather than authority. "Dr. Bennett, I believe this court could benefit greatly from your insights," he said, making a decision. "Would you consider conducting a training session for our staff? Help us recognize and address these hidden biases." The spectators watched as the power dynamic in the room shifted once again. The defendant had become the teacher, the judge had become the student, and the courtroom had transformed into a classroom for social justice. Sarah's eyes sparkled with professional interest. This was exactly the kind of institutional change her research aimed to inspire. "I would be honored, Your Honor. Perhaps we could start with today's interaction as a case study." Judge Harrison nodded, a mix of humility and determination on his face. He picked up his gavel, ready to make one more decision. The entire courtroom waited, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment when justice wasn't just served, but transformed. 2 weeks after the memorable courtroom encounter, Judge Harrison stood nervously at the entrance of the courthouse conference room. It was 8:45 a.m., and Dr. Bennett would arrive soon to conduct the first bias awareness workshop for the court staff. His hands fidgeted with his tie as he watched people file in. The large room buzzed with curiosity. Court clerks, lawyers, security officers, and even other judges had gathered, filling the space with whispered conversations. The story of Judge Harrison's interaction with Dr. Bennett had spread quickly through the courthouse, drawing unexpected interest in this training session. "I heard she made him completely change his ruling," one young clerk whispered to another. No, replied her colleague. "She actually turned the whole thing into a research study. I heard she's including it in her next book." At precisely 9:00 a.m., Dr. Sarah Bennett walked in, carrying her familiar worn leather bag. Unlike her previous courthouse appearance, today she wore a professional blazer over a simple blouse, though her warm smile remained the same. Judge Harrison stepped forward to greet her. "Dr. Bennett, thank you for agreeing to this," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I believe our experience that day can help create meaningful change in our justice system." Sarah set up her materials at the front of the room, arranging her research papers and connecting her laptop to the projector. The screen lit up with a simple title: Understanding and Addressing Institutional Bias, a Case Study in Justice. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had in the courtroom. 2 weeks ago, in courtroom 3B, we all witnessed something remarkable, not the presence of bias, which happens every day, but the willingness to acknowledge and address it. The room fell silent. Judge Harrison, now seated in the front row, nodded encouragingly. "Judge Harrison has given me permission to use our interaction as a teaching moment," Sarah continued, clicking to her first slide. It showed statistics about traffic violations and their enforcement patterns across different neighborhoods. "Notice these numbers," she pointed to a graph. "In Millbrook, where I was stopped, traffic citations are issued 3 times more frequently to people of color than to white drivers, despite equal rates of violations." Several officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. A senior clerk raised her hand. "But Dr. Bennett, couldn't there be other factors involved?" Sarah smiled. "Excellent question. This is exactly the kind of critical thinking we need. Let's explore those factors together." She clicked to the next slide, which showed her research methodology. As the workshop progressed, Sarah shared more findings from her studies. She discussed how small moments of bias could accumulate into systemic problems, using examples from various courthouses she had studied. Judge Harrison occasionally added his own insights, speaking candidly about his realizations from their encounter. When Dr. Bennett mentioned her credentials, he admitted to his colleagues, "I felt ashamed. Not just because I had misjudged her, but because I realized I had been making similar assumptions about many others who appeared in my courtroom." The room grew warmer as people began sharing their own experiences. A black bailiff described situations where he was mistaken for a defendant. A Hispanic clerk talked about how people often assumed she couldn't speak English properly. Sarah listened to each story, taking notes in her field journal. "This," she said, gesturing to the honest discussions happening around the room, "this is how change begins. By acknowledging our biases, we can start to address them." Near the end of the session, the young girl who had been in the courtroom that day appeared at the door with her mother. They had been invited by Judge Harrison himself. The girl clutched a notebook, her eyes wide with admiration as she watched Dr. Bennett lead the discussion. "Sometimes," Sarah concluded, looking around the room, "the most powerful lessons come from unexpected moments. 2 weeks ago, I walked into this courthouse expecting to pay a fine. Instead, we created an opportunity for understanding and growth." Judge Harrison stood up, addressing his colleagues. "Dr. Bennett has agreed to conduct monthly sessions with us, helping us examine and improve our practices." He paused, looking at the young girl at the door. "Because justice isn't just about following laws, it's about seeing and respecting every person who enters these halls." The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows, illuminating faces that now showed thoughtfulness and determination. In just one session, seeds of change had been planted in minds that would go on to make countless decisions affecting their community. 1 month after Dr. Bennett's first workshop, the changes in Jefferson County Courthouse were subtle but significant. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing a thick folder of court statistics that told a remarkable story. The numbers showed a clear shift in how cases were being handled across all courtrooms. "These figures are quite revealing," he murmured to himself, comparing the data from before and after Dr. Bennett's training sessions. Traffic citation fines had become more consistent across different neighborhoods. The racial disparities in sentencing were showing early signs of improvement. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, looking up to see Maria Rodriguez, one of the court clerks who had attended the workshop. "Judge Harrison," she began, holding a stack of papers, "I thought you should see this." She placed several letters on his desk. "We've been receiving feedback from people who've appeared in court recently. They're noticing the difference." The judge picked up the first letter, written by a young black man who had appeared before him last week for a minor offense. The words brought a smile to his face. "For the first time in my life, I felt truly heard in a courtroom." As he read through more letters, his phone buzzed with a news notification. The local paper had published an article titled "Changes at Jefferson County Court, a Model for Justice Reform." Dr. Bennett's research and their courthouse's transformation had caught the media's attention. Outside his chambers, the daily bustle of courthouse activity continued, but with subtle differences. Security guards greeted visitors with more warmth. Clerks took extra time to explain procedures to confused defendants. Public defenders received more respectful attention from their colleagues. Sarah Bennett, meanwhile, had been busy documenting these changes. She sat in her university office, surrounded by research notes and recordings from her courthouse observations. Her phone rang. It was another courthouse from a neighboring county, requesting similar training sessions. "Dr. Bennett," the voice on the phone said, "we read about your work in Jefferson County. Our judges are interested in implementing similar programs here." Sarah smiled as she scheduled another workshop. Her simple traffic stop had sparked a movement that was spreading beyond one courthouse. She opened her laptop to find emails from research colleagues across the country, all interested in studying and replicating the Jefferson County model. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harrison walked through the halls, noticing small but meaningful changes. The young girl who had witnessed the original incident was there with her school class on a field trip. She beamed when she saw him, proudly showing him her notebook where she had written, "I want to be a judge someday." In courtroom 3B, where it all began, a new sign had been posted. "Justice is blind to color, but we must not be blind to injustice." The words had been suggested by a court officer during one of Dr. Bennett's training sessions. Later that afternoon, Judge Harrison presided over a community meeting in the courthouse conference room. Representatives from various neighborhoods, including Millbrook, sat together discussing how to improve relationships between law enforcement and residents. "What happened with Dr. Bennett?" the judge addressed the group. "Opened our eyes to problems we had ignored for too long. But more importantly, it showed us that change is possible when we're willing to acknowledge our mistakes and learn from them." A police officer who had attended the training raised his hand. "Since the workshops, I've started approaching traffic stops differently," he admitted. "I ask myself, am I making assumptions about this person before they even speak?" The meeting continued as community members shared their experiences and suggestions. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the courthouse steps where, just a month ago, Dr. Bennett had arrived expecting only to pay a fine. Judge Harrison closed the meeting with words that would later be quoted in Dr. Bennett's next research paper. "True justice begins with self-reflection. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity, regardless of how they look or what they wear." As people filed out of the conference room, the young girl from the field trip lingered behind. She approached the judge's bench, clutching her notebook. "Judge Harrison," she said softly, "do you think things will keep getting better?" The judge smiled, remembering how his own transformation had started with a simple traffic citation and a respected anthropologist in casual clothes. "Yes," he replied, "as long as we keep learning and changing, things will definitely keep getting better." 6 months had passed since the memorable courthouse incident. Dr. Sarah Bennett sat at her desk in the university library, reviewing the final draft of her latest research paper. The title read, "From Traffic Stop to Transformation, a Case Study in Institutional Change." The afternoon sunlight filtered through the library's tall windows, illuminating her computer screen where dozens of charts and graphs displayed the remarkable changes at Jefferson County Courthouse. Her research assistant, Jason, knocked gently on the open door. "Dr. Bennett," he said excitedly, "you've got to see this." He handed her the latest issue of the American Journal of Justice Reform. "Your preliminary findings are already being cited by courts across the country." Sarah opened the journal, finding multiple references to what was now being called the Bennett-Harrison Protocol, a systematic approach to identifying and addressing institutional bias in the justice system. The protocol had been named after both her and Judge Harrison, recognizing their collaborative effort in creating change. "Look at these numbers," Jason pointed to a chart in her draft. "Complaint rates down by 40%, consistent sentencing patterns across all demographics, and increased community trust scores. The data is incredible." Sarah smiled, remembering the young girl who had wanted to become a judge. That same girl, now a regular visitor to the courthouse's new youth program, had written the opening quote for her paper. "I used to be scared of courts. Now I see them as places where people learn to be fair." Meanwhile, across town, Judge Harrison was being interviewed by a national news network. The cameras rolled as he spoke candidly about his experience. 6 months ago, I was part of the problem, he admitted to the interviewer. Meeting Dr. Bennett didn't just change how I handled one case, it changed how I understand justice itself. The reporter leaned forward. And the changes at your courthouse have inspired similar programs nationwide? Yes, Harrison nodded, but it's more than just programs. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how people think about fairness and authority. He held up a copy of Dr. Bennett's preliminary report. The data proves that when we address our biases openly, everyone benefits. Back at the university, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from the department chair. The governor's office had called, requesting her expertise in developing statewide judicial training programs. Her simple research project about traffic stops had evolved into something far bigger than she had imagined. In courtroom 3B, now decorated with artwork from local schools showing their vision of justice, a new generation of law students observed proceedings. They watched as judges, trained under the Bennett-Harrison protocol, handled cases with newfound awareness and equity. Notice, the professor whispered, how the judge asks open-ended questions, regardless of the defendant's appearance or background. This is direct implementation of Dr. Bennett's research. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the courthouse to collect final data for her paper. The changes were visible everywhere, from the revised booking procedures to the multilingual signs welcoming visitors. Even the security guards have been trained to recognize and challenge their own biases. Judge Harrison met her in the conference room where she had conducted her first workshop. Dr. Bennett, he said, holding up a draft of her paper, your research is going to change how we think about justice in this country. Sarah shook her head modestly. Change happens when people like you are willing to acknowledge mistakes and take action. My research just documents the process. As they walked through the courthouse halls, they passed the spot where their first interaction had occurred. The young girl who wanted to be a judge was there again, this time shadowing a female judge as part of the new mentorship program. Dr. Bennett, she called out excitedly. I got an A on my school paper about bias in the justice system. Sarah paused to congratulate her, remembering how this same girl had witnessed the original confrontation 6 months ago. Now she was part of the change they had started. Judge Harrison watched the interaction, then turned to Sarah. You know, the traffic stop might have been the best thing that ever happened to this courthouse. Sarah nodded, thinking about all the lives that have been touched by their accidental encounter. Her research paper would tell the story of institutional change, but the real story was in the daily interactions happening around them, in the small moments of recognition, respect, and understanding that were becoming the new normal in Jefferson County Courthouse. 1 year had passed since Dr. Sarah Bennett's traffic stop had sparked a revolution in judicial reform. On a bright morning, she stood at the podium in the largest conference hall of Jefferson County Courthouse, addressing a national symposium on justice reform. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and court administrators from across the country. Judge Harrison sat in the front row, his silver hair now a familiar sight at such gatherings. Behind him, representatives from 50 different court systems waited eagerly to hear about what the media had dubbed the Bennett effect. A year ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had that first day in court. I stood in this building expecting to pay a traffic fine. Instead, I witnessed the beginning of a transformation that has spread across our nation's justice system. She clicked through slides showing the year's remarkable statistics. 23 states had adopted the Bennett-Harrison protocol. Over 200 courthouses had implemented bias awareness training. Racial disparities in sentencing had decreased significantly in participating courts. In the audience, the young girl who had witnessed it all, now a regular participant in the courthouse youth program, sat with her mother, taking careful notes. She wore a t-shirt that read Future Judge and had started a justice club at her middle school. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah continued, gesturing to a new installation in the courthouse lobby. It was a wall of photographs showing the human impact of their work. People from all walks of life sharing their experiences of fair treatment in court. Judge Harrison stood up to join her at the podium. Together, they had become powerful advocates for justice reform, their unlikely partnership proving that change could start with a single moment of recognition. Dr. Bennett's research didn't just identify problems, he addressed the crowd. It showed us solutions. It taught us that true justice requires constant self-reflection and willingness to change. The symposium had drawn international attention. News cameras captured the moment as Sarah unveiled her latest initiative, a nationwide mentorship program connecting experienced judges with young people from underserved communities. "The young girl who watched our first interaction," Sarah said, pointing to the student in the audience, "is now mentoring other children who dream of careers in justice. This is how change sustains itself, through generations." During the lunch break, Sarah walked through the courthouse halls with Judge Harrison. The building had changed significantly. New artwork celebrated diversity, signs welcomed visitors in multiple languages, and a dedicated community outreach office helped people understand their rights. "Remember the traffic stop?" Judge Harrison chuckled. "Who would have thought it would lead to all this?" Sarah smiled, recalling the tension of that first encounter. Sometimes the best research comes from unexpected moments. Later that afternoon, they gathered in courtroom 3B for a special ceremony. The room where it all began was being dedicated as a training center for judicial reform. The young girl cut the ribbon, her future judge t-shirt drawing smiles from the crowd. As the ceremony concluded, a group of international justice reform advocates approached Sarah. They wanted to implement similar programs in their countries, proving that the impact of that simple traffic stop had crossed oceans. "Dr. Bennett," one of them said, "your work has given us a blueprint for change. But more importantly, it's given us hope that change is possible." Judge Harrison watched as Sarah scheduled more workshops and training sessions. His own transformation from a biased judge to a champion of reform had become a case study in her latest book. The sun was setting as the symposium ended, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows. Sarah packed up her materials, pausing to look at a new plaque on the wall. It read, "Justice is not just what we do, but how we see each other." The young girl approached her one last time. "Dr. Bennett," she said excitedly, "when I become a judge, I'm going to make sure everyone feels heard in my courtroom." Sarah hugged her, remembering how this child had witnessed both the problem and its solution. "That's exactly what justice needs," she replied. As they left the courthouse, Judge Harrison turned to Sarah. Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed because of one traffic stop." Sarah looked back at the building, now a symbol of transformation across the nation. "It wasn't the traffic stop that created change," she said wisely. "It was our willingness to learn from it." The setting sun painted the courthouse in golden light, illuminating the words newly carved above its entrance, "Where justice meets understanding." The legacy of their accidental encounter would continue to shape the future of justice, one courtroom at a time.